The time is just gone 24 minutes past 4 p.m. We continue with the Iftar Drive this afternoon. And it's time now to join Ashraf Patel, who is a Digital Development Associate at the Institute for Global Development. We're talking about the G7, and they've wrapped up their meeting. And there are accusations against China and in terms of human rights abuses, and also against Russia. So it does appear as if these are the two countries that have been targeted by the G7 as being the biggest threats that are at this point in time, and also at the same time looking at some of the other issues with regards to the pandemic and vaccines. But talking about these two countries in particular, we joined now on the line by Ashraf Patel. Ashraf, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, Brother Inayat and listeners. Hope you're all well.
Yes, alhamdulillah, very well, and trust and hope that you're doing well. You're having a great Ramadan, inshallah.
Shukran, yes.
Right, Ashraf, let's talk about the G7 meeting that is now wrapped up. And I want to talk in particular about the two countries that have been the target. The perception, according to the G7, is these two countries are the biggest threats currently. And looking at China, obviously, as far as human rights goes, the Xinjiang region, the Uyghur Muslims, and Russia on the other side, also under fire as far as some of their involvement is concerned, particularly against Ukraine.
Yes. So basically, the G7 is the world's capitalist bloc. It was formed in the 70s, and then it used to be the Paris Club of creditor nations. And of course, their agenda is to Western dominance and hegemony over the world. So that is the root of the institution. Our view, obviously, in the South, in the developing South, in Africa, in BRICS, is that basically it's the same old story of Western values, Western capitalism basically trying to assert itself because it is in a crisis. And the COVID world has showed up the weaknesses of Western democracies and neoliberalism. By contrast, China especially, and Russia to some extent, has weathered the COVID storm and are actually stronger than before. And so I think it's more to do with economic rivalry, some form of jealousy as well, because the Chinese economy is now growing at 7% a year, largely unaffected with COVID, and it's engaging in COVID development work where it's donating vaccines to the poor countries, unlike Western nations, which is selling and hoarding and creating scarcity of vaccines. So that is the backdrop to the G7 meeting.
Yes. Now, obviously, Ashraf, two wrongs don't make a right. And obviously, we are critical of China as well when it comes to the human rights violations of the people in the Xinjiang region, the Uyghurs in particular. But we know for far too long, the issue of the Uyghurs, has been on the table, and we know that it's been going on for a very, very long time. But only recently we've seen the light of the West and the United States and Britain and some of these G7 countries starting to make certain noises as far as Xinjiang and the Uyghurs are concerned. And the question is, why have they been silent for such a long time? Is it now because of economics playing out? Is it because of the trade wars that we've seen not very long ago under the Trump administration, that now China is the target of these Western nations?
Yes, it's a little of everything, and human rights is always instrumentalized, meaning that Western nations choose human rights issues in a strategic geopolitical framework. So it's not about human rights from an ethical or genuine localized point of view. it's sort of instrumentalized in trade and global relations. And that's the problem. So, for instance, where is the condemnation on the occupation in Kashmir, for instance? Purely because India is moving more toward the pro-West stance. The G7 then did not put anything on the Kashmir issue on the agenda. Why? So those are broader questions that we need to unpack. Or, for instance, the abuses of African Americans and the Black Lives Movement in the U.S. It's a huge human rights issue, but very little was in the G7 final communique. And then one can conclude that it is instrumentalized. So definitely the issue in China and the Uyghurs must be addressed, but so should other human rights abuses, etc. So this is the broader contradictions within the G7.
Well, it certainly is, and obviously, that list can go on and on and on, Ashraf. You just cited the example of Kashmir only, but there is a huge list, and this list is we include the Rohingya, we include the Yemenis, we include the Palestinians, and as I said, this list will just go on, and it is again about a selective condemnation as far as human rights is concerned, because these very same G7 countries are not champions of human rights either.
Yes, of course. So I think the G7 is actually lived its sell-by date a decade ago. That's why we have the G20 formed in 2009. That is a more functional global forum, and it was formed to address the global financial crisis at the time. And I think the G20 would carry more weight. Much more good work is happening in the G20 because most of the regional powerhouses are there. China is there, South Africa is there, Russia is there, India is there, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. So you've got a much more broader base of regional powers. And maybe the G20 is a much more inclusive forum that can address the post-COVID world order.
Just looking at the concerns raised about Russia and the Ukraine, what are those, Ashraf?
Look, traditionally, Russia was a member of the G8. The US brought it on in the 90s when they tried to promote market economy in Russia, but it failed hopelessly because it was just a complete chaos and it made Russia poorer. So they tried to co-opt Russia into the West, but the problem there is, again, with Ukraine, Russia sees it more as an internal matter, whereas the West sees it as a European matter. And as a result, it has caused a lot of strife, and then sanctions were imposed. And so Russia was expelled from the G8, now it's G7. But then the problem there is why was Russia expelled on an occupation, but the US continued in Libya, for instance, in 2012, where they occupied Libya or invaded or whatever. And so all these contradictions pop up all the time. France in North Africa, etc. So then again, you see these issues of invasion or whatever are all instrumentalized in the international arena. And so that is why the G7 will always be problematic. It's elitist, it's exclusive, and it's rooted in the Western capitalism and values. And those values are not shared amongst other civilizations or regions in the world. And so that's why I said the G20 is a more functional forum than other forums like BRICS, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, certainly, and I think, when we're talking about the capitalist ideology, and it's built basically on greed, on selfishness, and we see it with these G7 countries, obviously, the last to actually comment in terms of human rights, because if you look at France, for instance, recently we've seen so much happening in France. We've seen now with the renewed hijab ban, the separatism bill, all these things have been playing out, and also in terms of who they've been supporting over the years. And they've been supporting the very, very same people across many areas, across many parts around the world who are guilty of gross human rights abuses. For instance, like Saudi Arabia that we're looking at, we know what has been happening in Yemen, where 80% of Yemen is in poverty, in abject poverty. And as I said, Ashraf, there's just so much more we can talk about as far as these G7 countries, are concerned, and adopting what is called a moral high ground.
Yes, yes. Remember, human rights can advance an imperial agenda, and it has been for the last 40, 50 years. But I think the world is, in a COVID world, there's a strategic geopolitical and geo-economic shift to the east. China is the rising superpower with Russia and the Eurasian belt. You see, the Silk Road is the most strategic region in the 21st century, and that includes all of the Caucasus. And that is the significant geo-economic center of the 21st century. And already China is leapfrogging with massive infrastructure development, etc. And I think the West is feeling rattled, and maybe the G7, all these statements are in that context. They are feeling China and Russia are going very fast, and there is some counter to their power, or significant counter to their power. China has resources, it's got the Belt and Road Initiative, it's got billions and billions in surplus, whereas the US is in deficit. So there is a shift. And it could be quite interesting to see how all these things play out in the next decade or two.
Well, Ashraf, let's see what happens. But as always, we appreciate you taking time out, talking to us here at Salam Media. We appreciate your time with us, and Allah accept. Allah reward your efforts. And yes, a few days to go before the end of Ramadan, whatever is left of the month. Allah keep you safe, and please make the best of the month of Ramadan, inshallah.
Ameen. Shukran to you, Inayat. Keep up the great work and keep on going strong.
Ameen, ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That brings us straight on to 5:36 p.m. And shortly we will be heading for an ad break. We have got the Asr Azan also coming up. And what is also coming up at around 4:45, we'll be paying a tribute to Muslim broadcasters and journalists. And today it is the turn of Macfarlane Moleli, a seasoned broadcast journalist. So we'll be talking with Macfarlane in a few minutes' time. And also